Question number 2, Honourable Annette King.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Does he stand by his statement that, quote, "There's always a risk with third-term governments, they get arrogant. There's always a risk that they will veer off into a space they haven't been and start surprising their supporters"?
Honourable Bill English, on behalf of the Prime Minister.
On behalf of the Prime Minister, yes, an observation based on watching the third term of the previous Labor government.
Supplementary
question, Honourable Annette King.
Was pulling the hair of a woman worker in a cafe arrogant, veering off into a space he hadn't been before, or just totally inappropriate behaviour?
Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, as the Prime Minister has acknowledged it was totally inappropriate behaviour, for which he apologised to the young woman concerned, and I might say well before public attention was drawn to the matter.
Supplementary question,
Supplementary question, Honourable Annette King.
Does he think that in modern New Zealand that it is okay to describe repeated and unwelcome pulling of a young woman's hair as banter, horseplay, joking around? If not, why has he attempted to minimise his weird behaviour?
Honourable Bill English, on behalf of the Prime Minister.
On behalf of the Prime Minister, he hasn't attempted to minimise the behaviour. He's acknowledged the inappropriate nature of that behaviour and dealt with the issue when it was drawn to his attention.
Supplementary question,
Supplementary question, Honourable Annette King.
Was the National Party warned of his hair-pulling behaviour before his actions became public? If so, when?
Insofar as there's Prime Ministerial responsibility, the Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, of course the Prime Minister had an indication about the behaviour because the young woman raised it with him. And he apologised to her. I might say that the Prime Minister has, through intensive interaction with the public over a long period as Leader of the National Party and Prime Minister, observed almost always the highest standards of appropriate behaviour.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Was there any communication between his office or staff and Rachel Glusina or the cafe owners following the breaking of this story?
Honourable Bill English, on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I haven't had the opportunity to establish whether that's the case or not, so simply can't answer that question.
Supplementary
question, the Honourable Annette King.
Does he stand by his statement that he, quote, needs to be better at reading the tea leaves when making decisions about how he will behave in public? If so, how often does he use tea leaves for advice?
The Honourable Bill English, on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, yes, he does stand by that statement. I might say part of the Prime Minister's disappointment at these events and the inappropriateness of behaviour is that in almost every other respect his interaction with New Zealanders is positive.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
What is the difference between his behaviour and that of Aaron Gilmore's?
Honourable Bill English. Order.
Mr Speaker, there are different circumstances and have both been dealt with appropriately.
Order, Mr Speaker.
A point of order, the Honourable
I
Annette
seek
King.
leave to table a Facebook post on the National Party's website where Ms Bailey told of the hair pulling.
I don't need any further assistance. It's available to all members if they want to look for it. Question number 3. Have a point of order?
No, supplementary question.
Supplementary question. The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Putting aside the numerous cafe Parnell incidents, how does the Acting Prime Minister explain the countless photographs of Mr Key stroking young girls' hair, and what psychological condition is that?
Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, I reject all the imputations of that question. The Prime Minister has a track record which I know opposition parties resent, and that is of very positive interaction with the whole range of the New Zealand community. In this case, he has acknowledged the inappropriateness of his behaviour and dealt with it well before it came to public attention, because in his view, if the young woman felt that way about the behaviour, then it clearly wasn't appropriate and he had to deal with it.
Question.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Putting aside the Parnell Cafe case, what about the numerous other cases where he has not apologised at all, and how does he explain that?
Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, almost without exception, the interactions the Prime Minister has with the New Zealand public are not the subject of complaints. In fact, more than any other Prime Minister, he's open to those interactions and they are positive. And if anyone felt that he had acted inappropriately, they are able to raise that issue, and I think, as indicated by this incident, the Prime Minister will take responsibility for his behaviour and apologise accordingly.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
The Deputy Prime Minister ever advised him that he undertakes such behaviour in public?
Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, and very generally, the Prime Minister has been able to conduct a very positive relationship with the broader public without the benefit of advice from the Deputy Prime Minister.
Question number 3, Materia Ture.